Hi everyone, it's Lily and Courtney. We're so excited to be here as a part of Camp YA. And Courtney, do you want to introduce yourself and your book?
My name's Courtney Smyth, and I'm the author of The Undetectables. It's a fantasy mystery that's coming out in September, and it has a main character with fibromyalgia.
It's also very good, as I can attest with my found proof right here. Um, I'm Lillie Lainoff. I'm the author of One for All, which is a gender bent reimagining of The Three Musketeers with a main character with POTS syndrome. It came out in February.
And I can also attest to it being excellent. So, Lily, what made you want to write a character with POTS?
So for me, uh, one of the reasons why I wanted to write about a character with POTS to begin with is because uh, there aren't really a lot of traditionally published books with characters with POTS. As far as we know, One for All is the first book uh, published by a traditional publisher. That's YA that has a main character with POTS, which is pretty alarming given the fact that it's actually not that uncommon of a condition. Uh, I also spent a lot of time when I was in high school, when I was first diagnosed with POTS, in waiting rooms or, on the sidelines during gym class or just pretty much anywhere reading to escape from my current situation. And none of the characters were like me. And if there were chronically ill characters or disabled characters, they were always kind of cardboard cutouts or just a list of symptoms or perfect little angels who died in the hero's arms to teach them the lesson about the fragility of humanity and stuff like that. So I really wanted to write a book that centered a character with POTS that about wasn't about POTS, but it was a character who was living her life with POTS because I'm a person with POTS who lives her life. Um, and I also wanted to have a chance to write about what it's like to be a competitive fencer with POTS because I am a fencer with POTS. Courtney, so what made you want to write about a character with fibromyalgia?
Really, really similar to you. I wanted to write it. So, I have fibromyalgia. It took a really long time to be diagnosed. And I realized, kind of similar to you, that I had never actually read a book with a character with fibromyalgia. I know that there's Grimrose Girls. I know I haven't read it yet, shamefully, but I know that there's like a handful of titles where the characters have fibromyalgia, and they certainly never had it in a fantasy mystery setting that I have read, that it was traditionally published. And I just really wanted to explore the complexity of getting a diagnosis and the grief that comes with that sometimes, but also like the capacity to live a very full and interesting life while still dealing with your symptoms at the same time. Um, it just felt really, really important to me as I was writing it.
I think that's so important too because as of now we're recording this in July, which is Disability Pride Month, and I think that woo, but also I think as I have so much disability pride, but I think at the same time, you know, chronically ill and invisible and people with invisible disabilities, but specifically chronic illnesses, it is a bit strange sometimes because um, we want to have disability pride, but like you said, there is also sometimes a grief that, or whether that grief is because of internalized ableism or just a generalized grief, it is something that you have to deal with, and it's not something that you necessarily overcome because you don't overcome anything to do with disability or chronic illness. But I guess it's one of those things like grief in a generalized sense. It's something that kind of you learn to work with in your everyday life.
Yeah.
Um, I think that too, at least for me, when you were talking about genre and like fantasy and mystery, that really resonated with me too, because I think that I love current disability rep that we have in contemporary fiction, but it feels like that people just automatically assume that that's the only genre that disabled and chronically ill characters can exist in, as if we can't, you know, save the world or, dual bad guys, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that when I was a teenager, at least, I loved reading fantasy. But, to have books like yours, and I hope books like mine, I think that it's really important for teenagers and just readers of all ages to kind of see themselves in these books and to not think that, oh, there aren't people like me in these books, therefore there must be something wrong with me, or I'm not worthy of being in this type of literature.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I also had that experience of reading fantasy and not really seeing my experience reflected. And I really wanted to kind of, for Mallory, my main character, all of her friends have gone off to college and they've all kind of moved on with their lives. And she had a plan, and that plan fell to pieces. And I feel like that is such a common experience for a lot of people, especially when you're a teenager and that you become chronically ill, or perhaps like you have been disabled for a while and you get more symptoms, and whatever your plan was, it doesn't play out. That it's really important to be able to see yourself in several different settings, because like if you don't see it, how are you supposed to know that there are people out there who believe in you and who believe in your ability to operate in those roles?
What's the response been like? Because I know that, you're still in the very early reader stage because your book hasn't come out yet, but have you had any reader feedback yet um, from people with fibro?
It's actually been so nice, the amount of people who have been really just pleased to see the word written down, like somebody using the word to describe their experience. People are like, wow, I've never read a book where somebody has the same thing I do, or even heard of a book that somebody has the same thing that I do. And that's been amazing, because that was what I'd hoped the most would come out of it, that people would see Mallory and see a character who knows how they feel and is living her life. And I just, yeah, it's actually been, it kind of makes me nearly want to cry every time I see it, like genuinely, because I know it would have meant a lot to me to see that when I was going through the process of being diagnosed. And it's just really, really lovely to see people have that response. How's it been for you with people with POTS, especially as I know you were saying earlier that it's not that uncommon, but I feel like it's a thing that unless you know somebody with it, people haven't necessarily heard of it.
So I think that like I get very teary when I start thinking about the reader response. Because when I wrote One for All, um, very early on in the process of going on submission, I was told a lot of times, oh, well, there isn't a market for this, or oh, we don't think there's readership for this. So to go from that, then be getting messages when One for All first came out, I was getting multiple messages a day about how One for All changed people's lives in the sense that I had messages from teenagers who were saying, I just got diagnosed with POTS and I thought my life was over, but One for All gave me hope. Like you said, that I can actually accomplish things, to people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, who were saying, I have POTS and I never thought that I would get to see a book in my lifetime that had POTS representation, and it's here. Um, I don't want to go into like specific details because the messages are very, very private, and I feel just very blessed and privileged to have people share their stories with me. But I did get one message from someone recently, somebody with POTS, who had to quit the other sports that they did because they weren't able to, and they read One for All and they thought, oh, maybe I should try fencing. And now they're fencing and they love it. And it's like, and they're able to do it. And it's been months and they've started to compete. And it's just one of those things where I think that we all have different reasons as to why we write and to why we want to publish books. And I mean, I've wanted to be a writer and an author since I was 5 years old. So at the beginning, it was just, oh, I really want to write stories and I really want my books to be out in the world. But as I've gotten older and as I got POTS and as I started to, learn about the chronic illness community and the disability communities, you start to realize that, books have so much power. Um, and now for me, it's one of the most rewarding things is specifically the reader responses of people with POTS and people with chronic illnesses.
I love that. I love so much that like Tanya gave people that. And it's exactly what you were saying before. It's not about overcoming, because there is nothing to overcome. It's just giving people an option that you can do something, you can achieve something, and it's possible within the new constraints or the limitations that you have in other areas of your life. You can still do things. And I think it's really meaningful coming from somebody who has that, as like it's coming from beyond internalized ableism as well, that you're not believing that like you have to pretend you're not disabled, like you can be disabled and you can be something else. And I think that's incredible. And I'm so glad you've had that reader response, because that's so amazing.
And I think too the other important thing is like, especially when we talk about internalized ableism, I think that something that I tried to portray with Tanya, and I think that I've tried to be as open about as possible, is that um, you know, overcoming internalized ableism, because I think that overcoming is that is the correct context in which we can use the word overcome when it comes to disability, is internalized ableism or ableism. Um, it's not a switch that you flip, right? You don't just wake up one day and go, okay, I don't have any more internalized ableism. I love myself and I am totally content in being disabled and chronically ill, and world, here I am. Um,
It's a constant learning, like a
yeah,
constant thing that you have to keep unlearning and learning about as you go.
and it's a choice. It's a choice that you have to make every single day to go, okay, today I am not going to be hard on myself because I'm having a flare. I am not going to be hard on myself because can't, at least in the US, in DC where I live, it is miserably hot outside and I am staying indoors in the air conditioning. I'm not going to be sad that I might be a little bit sad, but I'm not going to beat myself up over the fact that I can't, go outside and interact with the world because it is a sauna. Um, but I really am curious to know. So, um, Mallory's world, what were the most challenging parts of creating Mallory's world?
So Mallory
How
lives in,
we're
in,
living
in a magical, it's a fantasy city, a town, I guess, in England. It's not real at all. I mean, I completely made it up, but I put it in
Gosh
between.
darn it.
I put it. I put it in between some real places. So it's just kind of planted in there. And in that world, I wanted to make magic a really natural part of it, but it was actually quite challenging to be like, here's magic, but Mallory doesn't really use it because it takes energy. Because I really wanted to represent how magic in this world takes the same amount of physical energy as it does to do anything. Like it just is, but and magic is just a part of life, but you still are responsible for using it in a way. And when you have fatigue, as Mallory does as a big part of her illness, you don't have the extra energy to do things. And with magic, she was finding that using it, she was overstepping like her limitations, because and like her energy levels, because magic you can't break down into smaller steps in the way that you do when you are chronically ill and stuff is harder for you. I feel like for a lot of chronically ill people, you have to think about things in a completely different way. So it was quite challenging to be like, here's the magical world, and also Mallory can't use any magic. So there's magic, but there isn't really. And also, I was trying to balance that with Mallory, because Mallory does experience a lot of internalized ableism throughout the story, that she's unlearning as she goes. But it was quite difficult to really not cut any corners and really, but still make her feel like a magical person. She's a witch, but it's a witch in terms of name as opposed to in terms of her abilities. But it doesn't. Her being disabled doesn't take away from the fact that she's a witch. So that was quite difficult, like creating this magical world with a person who is magical but can't be magical for illness reasons, and I found that quite hard. What about you? What about I suppose, like, because you're a fencer, so you know what Tanya was able to
Yeah.
do, but the setting is historical, and there's kind of different rules in play, I think, for Tanya.
Right. So, for me at least, for writing about pots within a historical adventure context slash fantasy, I mean, to be perfectly clear, One for All is not straight historical fiction, just like The Three Musketeers was not straight historical fiction. It was historical fantasy. That's what Dumas was doing. In One for All, I still didn't want, even though it was fantasy and historical, I didn't feel like I could put the name Potts on the page. So, um, POTS as a diagnosis, that term didn't really exist until the very late 20th century. So, what I did when I was writing is I started thinking about um, the very physical symptoms that are an effect of POTS. So, stuff not like blood pressure, because there wouldn't have been a term like blood pressure then. But for example, A lot of people with POTS, including myself, one of the signs that your blood pressure is doing some wonky stuff is your extremities turn purple and gray, especially your feet. So that's something that Tanya notices. I can't use terms like heart rate because that didn't exist then, but Tanya can notice that her heart is pounding in her chest quickly. Um, I also incorporated, I tried to call it Tanya's idea of what she has is called the dizziness, um, which is kind of a brushing over of all the symptoms of POTS because POTS is a lot more than dizziness, but dizziness is kind of the one connecting symptom that at least I've noticed across everyone with POTS. Um, and for Tanya, it was really important for her to come up with this term and this like claiming of it because it's not just an aspect of her identity, but as this sense of, okay, I've had these doctors tell me that I'm making this up. I have all these people in my life who think that I'm weak. I'm going to claim this word, this term for myself. And it's not made up and it's not all in my head. It's actually happening to me. So that was really important for me. In terms of the fencing scenes with Potts, I think that those were the most fun to write for me, at least, because I mean, I know a lot of writers will talk about how they skip ahead to write kiss scenes, and I'm like, why do that? I skip ahead to write the duel scenes. That's the fun stuff. Um, but for me, I have spent so long as a chronically ill fencer because I started fencing when I was 8 or 9, and I developed POTS when I was 12 or 13. So I'm in my late 20s now. So I've been a fencer with POTS a lot longer than I have been any point in time a fencer without POTS. So um, I just tried to incorporate as much of my personal experience into Tanya's story as I could. Because at the end of the day, I also knew that everybody's experience with POTS is different. And the only way that I could get across an authentically written character with POTS on the page is if I really just stuck to my own symptoms.
That makes so much sense. And I love also that your fencing scenes are so authentic because that just makes them like 20 times more awesome. That you're like, yeah, I know how to do this. That's really cool.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It was a lot of fun writing, kind of coming up with historical equivalents of modern day exercises. So there's this one moment in One for All where where Tanya messes something up and um, her father is like, "Oh, you have to do an extra 30 minutes of embroidery." Whereas if that same thing happened in modern day, I mean, we're usually doing push-ups, but it was fun to kind of incorporate kind of the um, modern day exercises and their equivalents into a historical setting. Um, so for Mallory, I'm really curious to know about desirability in the book and kind of the elements of platonic relationships and romantic relationships and how that works in the book.
Yeah, so like I mean it's kind of like what you were saying about for how with Tanya she felt that people didn't really understand what was going on and felt that she was a bit weird for having these symptoms or that she was making them up in some way. But for Mallory, a lot of that is internal. And I think she gets to a point, it's quite early in the book, she gets to a point where she feels that she doesn't deserve any of her friendships because she's not able to. So, I mean, the internalized ableism is strong in this one, but she just feels like she's not worth a relationship, that she's not bringing anything to the table, or she just kind of slow people down, and she kind of feels like her friends are moving on and they don't need her. And her friends don't feel like that at all. And I hope that that's quite clear that this is very much Mallory's working through her own grief and her own feelings about the way her life is supposed to go. But she's been so lonely for so long as well because everybody has moved on. That I really wanted to show how, as she starts to kind of allow herself to spend time around people again, that they are so determined to love her. Like they really want to love her and they really want her to know that she is great. And she's just like, no. But that it's all her own stuff. And it's all her own stuff that she's figuring out. And in those platonic friendships, I really wanted to show that her friends can care about her and can do most of the right things. And it doesn't make her not sad and it doesn't make her not struggle with what she's going through. because I feel like that's a really big thing as well, that sometimes people are like, oh, well, all you need is love, or love kind of conquers all. And that's not necessarily the case, but it can make things a lot better for people if they have good people in their lives. And that was something I really, really wanted to show for Mallory. It's quite slow for her as well. Like there is a point where I think she starts to realize that maybe if she did want a relationship, that she's bringing stuff to the table. Um, but that's, it's a slower arc, and it's a slower arc for reasons. But I do hope that that comes across in the book, that she is very, very worthy. Um, Romance is a bigger aspect of One for All, though. So do you want to tell me about
It
Tanya?
it is, and this is where I have to be very careful to not stray into spoiler territory. Uh, but for Tanya, at least, she's growing up in a time period where um, the the only sense of safety that her mother can think of for her is that she gets married. Um, because, as her mother at one point says, who's going to take care of you after we are gone? Which is a very loaded concept in
Mm.
terms of the ableism, in terms of the sexism, just in terms of the whole lot of isms. Um, but for Tanya, I really wanted to portray what it was like, what it's like growing up as a chronically ill teenager, and not necessarily dating, because that wasn't really a term in 17th century France, but what it's like to have crushes, or what it's like to um, fall for boys, and when do you tell somebody that you're chronically ill if you're invisibly disabled, and what does that look like, and what responses do you get? And Tanya has been burned in the past when it comes to that, so that impacts all of her relationships, whether those are romantic relationships or platonic relationships. And she very much goes into it, like you said, in terms of thinking, oh, I require so much from people. I don't have anything to give back to them. How does this work? And I think that one of the things that I hope that One for All gets across, that I truly believe in, is that relationships are not a 50-50 thing. Different people have different things to bring to relationships. At different times in relationships, some people will have to do more than other people. It's just how the human existence works. And I think that for Tanya, her realization of that kind of goes hand in hand with her journey to unpacking her internalized ableism. And it also goes hand in hand with her the acceptance that's shown to her by the other musketeers, Arya, Portia, and Thea, and how they not only accept her, but they actively make things more accessible for her. And that was a big part, I think, um, what I wanted to portray. Um, so, can you talk a little bit? We already talked a little bit about this, but um, healthy friendships, um, and how we portray them, in which disability is supported and recognized. How does that work for Mallory?
So for Mallory, what I tried to do with Mallory is that her friends do mess up, but it's about how imperfectly they all handle it, but everybody's trying their best. And I think that was something I was really, really keen on showing, that you can want to do the right thing, you can do the wrong thing, you can learn from it, and then you can do the right thing. Because I think when you become disabled, you don't necessarily automatically learn how to navigate the world any more than the people around you necessarily learn how to navigate the world. And I wanted to show friends who give Mallory space to say what she needs and try to do the right thing. And even if Mallory doesn't necessarily give clear instructions on what she needs, especially as she's kind of afraid to ask for what she needs, I wanted it to be a case that they could have those conversations where they go, I've messed up. And or I feel this way or I feel that way. And they give each other that space. And I think that was like the healthy part for me, was really showing friends who just allow for growth and support, and that exactly what you were saying. Like, I think it's friendships are not transactional, and that people need different things at different times. And Mallory's not aware of what she brings to the table, so she assumes she's bringing nothing, that everybody's giving her everything, and that makes her a bad person to be around, or just a difficult person to be around. And everybody tries really hard to show her that that's not the case. But I really, really wanted it to be that she just, like, she's the one that's in her way, as opposed to everybody else making her life difficult. Because I think that's the thing too, that a lot of people go through. Friendships are massively upheaved when you become chronically ill, because your life changes. Like, it's a literal life changing thing from inside and out. So how you navigate the world changes. And Mallory's still trying to figure out how to navigate the world. So I wanted the people around her to be trying to figure it out with her and doing their absolute best. And that was kind of what I tried really, really hard to do with the Undetectables.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that for me too, that was something that the idea of healthy friendship, because I mean, I don't think this is a spoiler. At the beginning of One for All, Tanya talks about her best friend breakup, which I think a lot of chronically ill people have been through, in the sense of there's almost always one really good friend, at least one really
At
good
least one.
friend or one best friend whom you're really close to, and then you become chronically ill, and then all of a sudden, they don't want to hang out with you anymore, and they don't want to be your friend.
Yeah.
Um, and Tanya is kind of working from that example and that context, and that's how she approaches all of her friendships in the book. Um, and it's like you said, it is something that she has to overcome. But it is something that I think is only possible because of the friendships that she makes, and the way that they show her unconditional support. Um, um, so we talked a little bit about this earlier, but so disability in the grief process, um, and what it's like to be, disabled and chronically ill. Um, and so could you talk a little bit about, how Mallory feels about that and how you portray that in the book?
Yeah. So it's kind of towards the beginning of the book. Because the book initially starts with Mallory when she's 14, and then we meet her again when she's 20. So she's had this experience of slowly her symptoms getting worse and her going through the diagnostic process. Her friends have all moved away, and she really, really, really wants to go study forensic science in college. And she's had to put it off, and she's put it off, and she's put it off. Um, and she just feels this like hole, basically, where the life that she thought she was going to have is. And I think Mallory, what I tried to do with Mallory is really capture that feeling of grieving a life that you thought you were going to have, and I don't know if this is something you experienced when you developed POTS, but there is, for me, with fibromyalgia, was something that I thought was going to happen, was that I was just going to get better, that it was all going to go away, because I didn't know what it was. And these symptoms kind of, they come on really slowly. And that was something I had for Mallory, where like stuff was difficult. People kind of said, oh, it's anxiety, it's whatever. And I feel like a lot of people have that experience too, where they're told it's this, it's that, it's the other. And it's not. It has a name, and it has a, a set of symptoms that mean something. And I want Mallory to really be able to feel that. Like, I gave her space to feel that grief, but it can be so isolating and so hard to explain. And I think when you tell people who aren't disabled, this is what being chronically ill, or this is what being disabled means, a lot of the emphasis is on symptoms. And it was what you were saying at the beginning about how a lot of those characters that you were seeing in books were kind of one dimensional. They were just a set list of symptoms, and they weren't really capturing that experience of being disabled. I think a lot of the unspoken part is what it feels like, and it's not just like the physical symptoms of it. It's how it impacts you emotionally and how it impacts you mentally. And I really wanted Mallory to kind of have that full spectrum of feelings as she tried to process where her life was and where her life was going to go.
I think that too, there's this element of grief in terms of, there's a real loneliness, I think, that Mallory feels and also Tanya feels, because this element of that they don't really know anybody else who is going through something incredibly similar to them. And so, like, almost tying back to our first point, way back at the beginning of the conversation, in terms of there's no there's no example, right, set of showing that people can do things, right? There's no example for Mallory doesn't feel like there's an example, and Tanya doesn't feel like there's an example of ways for them to navigate the world. And I think that as far as Tanya is concerned, a lot of her grief kind of gets upended in certain ways because in relationship to her chronic illness, because there are a lot of things that she did grieve, like this idea of, oh, I'm never going to be able to marry for love, or oh, I'm never going to have true friendships, and those things get upended by the end of the book. Whereas her kind of traditional grief and the fact that she in the death of her father and um, moving through learning to accept herself while also learning to accept the fact that her father is gone um, creates really painful but interesting parallel in terms of her own acceptance of both things. I have so double question before we finish. So do you have advice that you'd give to people writing disabled characters in their stories? And what are some of your favorite books with disability and chronic illness representation?
Great double question. I think, yeah, so if I have advice for disabled people writing disabled characters, I would say write your experience. Write what you, and this is like a very good example of write what you know. You know what it feels like to live with your disability, no matter what that kind of disability is. So write it as you know it. I I there are, obviously, we're all being told in different ways that, oh, the market isn't there for this or it isn't there for that. Me and Lily are examples of people who've proven that wrong. So write your characters, write, like, and stand over your experience. That is your experience, and it's important. And somebody needs your book. And I would think for non-disabled people writing disabled characters, please research. Do your research as well as you can. And hire a sensitivity reader at some point, either with your publisher or if you can hire one on your own. It's really, really important. And it'll also give you insight. They're not there to tell you that you're wrong. They're there to give you insight into what it actually feels like to live with the disability that you are describing. And some of my favorite books with disabled characters. I mean, Six of Crows, obviously. One for All by Lillie Lainoff. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a great book. Um, and there's a book called What Walks These Halls by Amy Clarkin. It's got a character who's hard of hearing. It's a spooky YA ghost book, which I absolutely adore. Lily, advice you would give an
Oh,
able and a disabled author, and your favorite books as well.
right. So I think I'll come at this more from less of a craft perspective and more of just like generally your experience as a writer. Find a group of other disabled writers. And I mean, whether that's, I have a group called Disabled Kidlit Writers on Facebook, which used to have 15 members when we started and now has over 500. But it's really blossomed. And it has New York Times bestselling authors and also has people who are just starting to write. But whether it's a group like that or you know two or three other disabled writers and you just form a group, because there is a very specific experience to being a disabled author and publishing. And of course, it's different when it comes to physical disabilities um, and invisible disabilities and even down to POTS or fibromyalgia, or very specifics. But there are overarching things that we all deal with and all experience, that it's so much easier to get through the process when you have somebody in your corner who understands what you're going through. Um, I would say for non-disabled people writing disabled characters, I would say if it's a side character, I completely agree with what you said about, you know, research, and research isn't necessarily just going to, Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or Johns Hopkins or whatever website you go to and looking up the list of symptoms,
MMD.
right? It's going to it's looking up chat forums, and don't go into chat forums if you're not a member of that group and it's specifically for people of that group. But like if they're allowing people to come in, then you should join and ask questions. Also, if hiring a sensitivity reader, an authenticity reader, if you cannot afford that, you can always ask to do a manuscript swap because odds are you probably have something in your own lived experience that you have to offer in terms of trying to provide authenticity for somebody else's work. Um, but in terms of main characters, my big thing that I always tell people when they ask me, "Oh, can I write this book?" And I'm like, "I'm not going to tell you whether or not you can or cannot write something. I am not the disabled all overseeing authority on whether or not you can write something." But what I would say is take a step back and wonder why and ask yourself why do you feel that you need to write this character this specific way? What is gained by having the character disabled? And then the most importantly is, are you taking the mic from somebody else? Um, because disabled authors in publishing don't have a lot of opportunities.
Right.
And it's really important to remember that, um, you know, I am totally for increasing visibility and increasing awareness. That's important. But there are other ways that you can do that besides writing a disabled main character. And that's my spiel. As far as books with chronic illness and disability representation, I'm going to see if I can grab one of my favorites, which is Breathe and Count Back from 10 by Natalia Sylvester, which was recently a Pura Belpré and a Schneider Award honoree. It's an incredible, very loose reimagining of The Little Mermaid about a teenage girl with hip dysplasia and how she wants to be a part of this like mermaid wouldn't say exhibit, but it's really hard to describe, but it's very good.
Okay.
I also love, like you said, Six of Crows. Some of my other favorites are Hell Followed With Us, The Whispering Dark, all of Melissa C's books, all of Lee Berdugo's books. There are just so many good books. I really feel like that we are, slowly but steadily, the publishing industry is getting better. And I'm really excited to see kind of the newest wave of books with disability representation. And I just hope that, everybody who's listening and readers just know that the best thing to do if you want more disability representation is to support the books that already exist because that shows publishers that there's a market and then they buy more books and then the cycle continues.
Perfect. What a great ending. Thank you so much, Lillie, and thank you so much to Camp YA for having us. It's been such a lovely time to talk about this. The Undetectables comes out September 26th, and One for All is available everywhere now.
Thank you all so much.